This is Never Close the Inquiry with Nick Hagan. Welcome to Never Close the Inquiry, where I aim to demystify the right for the left and the left for the right, where if you come as a conservative, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about liberals. And if you come as a liberal, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about conservatives, with the whole idea that over time we'll create better conversations, better relationships, better arguments, and maybe 80 or 90 more steps down the road, a better country. I'm here with Nico Perrino, Executive Director of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Nico, thanks a ton for joining me. We're going to talk about the freedom of speech.
Free speech. Let's do it, Nick.
All right. So first off, I would like to get a sense of your personal background, because my understanding is that you have been at FIRE for your entire professional career.
Wasn't the plan.
Was not the plan. So let's go back, and I heard you talk about some of this on Ron Paul's podcast.
Yes.
And so I would like to get a sense of how you got to this point, because I feel it's not normal, I think, for most people, to end up dedicating their careers to the protection of, one particular freedom or a particular set of freedoms. Yeah.
Well, it started in fifth grade. I didn't know that it would lead to a career defending free speech principles, but in fifth grade, I had a teacher, Mr. Shields, who put on a play of The Trial of John Peter Zenger. And John Peter Zenger was an early colonial publisher before the United States of America even existed, who was criticizing the then colonial governor of New York, William Crosby, Bill Cosby, as coincidentally his name. And he was brought up on charges of seditious libel. And seditious libel is this principle that if you say something critical of someone, usually in the government, even if it's true, that could be a crime.
Right.
And he was guilty as sin. And
he had said something critical of the governor, all that.
Well, he had published stuff that was critical.
So under the statute, guilty.
Guilty.
Okay.
And he was brought before a judge, a jury, and ultimately acquitted in an early incident of jury nullification. And this really sort of enshrined the ethos that would come in many decades later, to be embodied in the First Amendment, the idea that you can criticize the government.
Right.
And so John Peter Zenger, even to this day, is a symbol of free speech and press freedom and of the resistance that Americans, then colonists, had to this idea of government censorship. Fast forward, I am starting to have my political, ideological, philosophical awakening. I become really interested in those early new atheists like Sam Harris, Dan Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, and whatnot, and start debating ideas, speaking out. And Christopher Hitchens, who's a polemicist who I've really come to admire over the years, died in 2011. I was a big free speech advocate, and he would do these debate tours with people who he disagreed with, including this evangelical pastor from Idaho, Douglas Wilson. And they had this great debate series. The DVD came out about it called Collision. I urge everyone to watch it. It's fantastic. You have Christopher Hitchens throwing out a line of scripture, calling it ridiculous. You have Douglas Wilson, who's a believer, coming back with another line of scripture to undermine Christopher Hitchens' point. It was the give and take, the debate and discussion that I so yearned for, and that when I got to college, I got to participate in as a member of various student groups. And in my senior year, it just so happened that Douglas Wilson was coming to campus. And Douglas Wilson, at that point, Christopher Hitchens had died. And so I thought I was going to play the Christopher Hitchens part in the Douglas Wilson, Christopher Hitchens debate. And so I'm super excited. He's coming there. There's going to be a question and answer period. But no sooner had I arrived that I realized something wasn't right. Students, my peers, started to protest. Signs were held up. Noisemakers were used. I believe there was even a fire alarm pulled. At a certain point, the students were escorted out of the building, and they were banging on the doors.
Yeah.
trying to get in or just to make noise. And Douglas Wilson, who I disagree with on almost everything, including ideas of faith at that point,
Yeah.
uh, said this line that I'll never forget. He said, "I always think I'm right, but I
Right.
don't think I'm always right. I always think
Right.
I'm right, but I don't think I'm always right." And I thought, this is the perfect encapsulation of what it means to be in college. The idea that you might have these deep convictions, but you have to hold them loosely and be open to the idea that alternative evidence could be presented that would undermine your previous position and force you, if you have an open mind, to change that mind.
And can I pause you right here for one second? Because I want to know this because I heard you tell some of the story on on the other podcast, and I didn't realize a little bit more of this background. So for those who are unfamiliar with Douglas Wilson, I was totally despite being very familiar, I think, with Christopher Hitchens, or reasonably familiar, and being a big fan of Christopher Hitchens. Also coming to that as a religious person, which is interesting. But
Well, I was religious too. I would go to church every day during the summer. I was Catholic.
yeah.
But
All right.
then
Well,
as
there you go.
you and
But
I have a similar
yeah,
background in that respect.
yeah, Hitchens, I mean, it just this d beautiful polemicist. One of the most, if you had to just, sit and listen to one person speak for the rest of your life, he'd be high up on the list of people you would wanna listen to. But Douglas Wilson, he's been in the news, or not the news, he's been in the on Twitter or wherever recently because he's fairly outspoken, fairly conservative. I believe he's got he's fairly influential among a lot of new evangelicals, including a lot of younger men that are
I imagine so, yeah.
yeah, okay. And so, yeah, when I heard you tell that story, often it seems like when people are defending free speech, they're defending it because it's to their benefit.
Mhm.
They're defending their side, and that is not how you were approaching that so much.
No, I wanted to be Christopher Hitchens. I wanted to debate
Right.
this guy who was one of the most articulate advocates and speakers on the other side.
Yeah,
I wasn't given the opportunity to do that because some of my peers determined that because they thought he was wrong, they had
yeah,
the right to ensure that nobody else could hear what he had to say. They made
yeah,
up everyone else's minds for them.
yeah.
And this is a principle that goes back to Frederick Douglass, who gave a famous speech called A Plea for Free Speech in Boston. Uh, Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, was trying to host an abolitionist meeting in Boston, and it had been shut down by an angry mob with police assistance.
Mhm,
This is what's come to be termed a heckler's veto,
mhm.
where hecklers come in deciding they don't want a certain speaker to speak and veto that speech.
Yeah,
And Frederick Douglass, at a later date, comes and gives a speech in defense of free speech and says that free speech is two sides of the same coin. It's the right to speak and the right to listen.
mm,
And in this case, the hecklers decided that not only did the speaker not have the right to speak, but the listener didn't have the right to
to
listen.
listen.
And I think in any free society, a listener and a speaker, to the extent they're both willing, should be able to exchange views and ideas. And that's something my peers didn't quite understand, or at least didn't believe in, if not explicitly, implicitly by their actions.
Mhm.
And so that was my senior year of college. And very shortly thereafter, I would go and work at Fire. It was 2012, so we're still sort of recovering from the Great Recession.
Mhm.
I know we're the same age, Nick, so you might have experienced that as well. I thought I was going to go into advertising and marketing, but during the
Huh,
previous summer, I had interned at Fire.
got it,
And so
okay.
Greg Lukianoff, the president and CEO of Fire, had a job opening. He called me up. He said, "We'd love for you to apply." I applied. And so in May of 2012, I packed up my things and went to Philadelphia. Not like Will Smith, but
Right.
although I did move to West Philadelphia like him.
Nice,
I lived off of Penn's campus.
nice. So you grew up okay, so you went to IU, to Indiana University. Are you from Indiana originally?
No, I'm from a suburb of Chicago.
From a suburb of Chicago. Okay, so Midwestern guy.
Yeah, if you go to IU, you can't say you're from Chicago because most
Ah,
people who go to IU and say they're from Chicago are actually from the Chicago suburbs. So
yeah,
people get a little bit prickly about that. But I'm like, okay, do you know where Elmhurst is? And they never know where Elmhurst is lives. I'm
I
like,
feel like I've
but
heard
you
of
know where
Elmhurst,
Chicago
but
is.
right, yeah, yeah. Okay, so you're from around Chicago, then you
I
go to
am.
IU, that now you're in Philadelphia, and your plan is initially you're just gonna stick there
2 years,
for
I thought.
2 years. Okay.
Yeah, 2 years, I thought. But um, the issues of free expression really started to pick up steam in 2013, 2014, 2015. I spent a year. I didn't like Philadelphia, so I
Mhm.
ended up moving to Washington, D.C. This was pre-COVID era, so you needed to be in an office. Fire
Mhm.
didn't have a DC office, so I go work for another organization called the Institute for Justice for a year. But then Fire opens up a DC office, recruits me back, and I help to launch its communications department with one or two employees. The department's now like 20 employees. It's grown quite a bit, and
Wow.
it's now capably managed by Matt Harwood, our VP
Mhm.
of comms.
Mhm.
But it was really exciting opportunity to get to grow a communications department in an environment where there was a lot of communications and public discussion surrounding free speech on campus issues. And
Yeah.
this is the time when microaggression policing, campus disinvitations were happening. What my experience at Indiana University hadn't really become a trend across the country where you had campus disruptions in a
Mhm.
significant way, but that would really start to unfold in the fall of 2014 with the deplatforming of former New York City Police Commissioner Ray Kelly at Brown University, and really
Mm.
pick up steam at places like Yale and Middlebury in the coming years.
Yeah. And so at this time, I feel, I don't remember exactly the first time I heard about fire, but at this time, given that a lot of the discussion around free speech issues centered around, campus cancel culture, and it usually involved, to the best of my recollection, people on the left shutting down speakers on the right. And I believe through this period, fire, because of its consistent public statements, and work on behalf of people that or in favor of free speech, did get associated with the political right for a bit, at least in the way that people looked at it.
Yes,
And yeah.
but because what is the biggest challenge when you're advocating for free speech? It's power.
Mm,
You're opposite power. You're
right.
fighting power. And so, in the campus context, where you have administrators, college faculty, and students that are overwhelmingly left leaning,
Mhm.
the viewpoints they're going to go after tend to be right leaning, conservative, libertarian, or even left leaning viewpoints that are outside or challenging of the orthodoxy.
Yeah.
So you get pigeonholed as a right wing free speech advocate, just like the old school ACLU got pigeonholed as left wing when they were defending all these left wing protesters during the McCarthy era, the civil rights era, the Vietnam War era. So you
Mhm.
often get lumped in as a free speech advocate with the content and viewpoint of the speakers that you're defending. And that's no different in the campus free speech context. And it's not true.
Mhm.
Fire has a politically and ideologically diverse staff. Our president and CEO has been a liberal. Our executive director during those years was an evangelical Christian, and our legal director was a former member of the Green Party, working on Ralph Nader's campaign. So they
No
come from
kidding.
across the political spectrum. I'm palms up. I've always kind of been a doctrinaire, small L libertarian,
Yeah.
but you get he's even a colleague who used to sit right outside my office who thought he was a communist. I'm not sure he quite understood whether that what communism entailed, but that's what he said. And so people who are at Fire understand this, and now
Yeah.
working under the Trump administration, we're often adversarial with the Trump administration, and we get called left wing hacks all the time
Yeah.
now. It's just
Yeah.
the nature of the work. I've got a thick skin for it.
I would imagine you'd have to develop one. I follow you on social media now, and I see what you post. And yeah, given who's in power now, it pretty much is, against what the Trump administration is doing on any given day.
Yes,
Um, so let and I think that's an important thing that I want people to understand, that this is not a uniparty, one side is doing this and the other side isn't, sort of thing. As much as people on both sides tend to try to, I think, position themselves as free speech advocates when it is to, maybe it's sincere, but certainly when it's to their benefit. When they are not in power, they like, we are just advocating for free speech, and we recognize that some of these people on our side might be wrong, but it's important that they be able to speak. Then they get in power, and it kind of flips. And so, I think, people are generally familiar with campus cancel culture. That has certainly been talked about a lot. What else have you seen from the political left, when they have held power?
sure.
Like, during the Biden administration, or we can go back to Obama. What have you seen that have been, like, particularly bad violations of free speech rights?
Well,
Or yeah.
during the 2010s, one of our big fights was against the Obama and later Biden administrations surrounding its interpretation of Title IX, which is a law that comes from the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that says you can't discriminate in federally funded educational programs based on sex.
Hmm. Okay.
And so in 2011, the Obama administration put out what's called this Dear Colleague letter that not only limited the amount of due process protections that individuals accused of sexual misconduct could receive on college campuses. It lowered the standard of proof, for example, to preponderance of the evidence standard, which is, we are slightly more than 50% sure that this person did it, as opposed to beyond a reasonable doubt or clear and convincing, which have higher standards. And many campuses did use those higher standards when someone was accused of rape, for
Yeah.
example.
Right.
But it also posited a new definition of sexual harassment that was harassment that um, it so the Supreme Court, I don't want to get too wonky here, in 1999 put out a
Yeah.
definition of pure on pure sexual harassment that said it's conduct so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that it effectively denies a student the right to an education. The
Hmm.
Obama administration gutted that standard, and Fire had been fighting that for many years.
Hmm.
We ultimately, with the first Trump administration, got the due process and free speech abridgments overturned. Biden tried to bring them back. Court struck those down. Trump administration comes in and puts in the previous regulations. There's so much backstory here. I'm like hesitant to
No,
get,
no, no. Yeah. I well,
but
and I think it would also be helpful to understand, why were they trying to do this in the first place?
because
Why?
campus rape,
Yeah.
because sexual misconduct was perceived to be a huge problem.
Yeah.
And Fire doesn't take a position whether it is or isn't a problem. I mean, any incident of rape is a problem, but
Hmm.
the universities and the criminal justice system need to prove the case, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And you're not proving the case by just making it easier to convict people. um,
Right.
and that's what they were doing. And in the process, also bringing people into the process who were exercising their First Amendment rights under the Constitution by punishing people who met this lower standard for pure and pure sexual harassment. But
Hmm.
there's that. We also saw an effort to target hate speech and to police speech along the lines of like microaggression. People might remember that.
Yeah.
DEI bureaucracies also had a censorial impact. And the thing that we were really worried about under a Kamala Harris administration was the continued policing of mis and disinformation, often through kind of nefarious, subtle, jawboning ways behind the
Okay.
scenes, but also in more overt ways. So that's what we were geared up for under a Kamala Harris, Tim Walz administration. Ultimately, that's not the administration we got. Now we've got a different set of problems.
Well, yeah, we'll get to those. So when you talk about, combating misinformation and disinformation, so, I read in Greg and Ricky's book, in Canceling of the American Mind,
Hmm.
that what you saw, when there were high profile, uh, what's the word, cancellations, or when people were banned from Twitter, banned from, whatever Meta
Yes.
platform, that you saw a commensurate uptick in usage on Gab and Telegram and other platforms that were more, that had different standards, that were more welcoming to people that had been deplatformed from Meta and Twitter and whatnot.
Hmm.
And so so maybe there's two prongs to the argument. I would enjoy hearing your argument against the combating of misinformation and disinformation.
I don't have an argument against combating mis and disinformation. I
Okay.
think people in a free society should be able to
Right.
to work through what is true and what is false in a voluntary manner. What I
Right.
have a problem with is
Right.
when the government tries to play the ministry of truth and come in and tell private social media companies who they must censor based on the idea that that person that they're demanding be censored engaged in a mis or
Right.
disinformation crime, so to speak.
Yeah.
That's the problem. And that's what the Biden administration and actually the Trump administration too, and under Trump 1.0 was doing with these private social media companies surrounding COVID.
Got it.
And so that's the problem in my mind. And now the Trump administration is doing it to all sorts of different news outlets. They're just calling it different things. They're calling it tortious interference or news
Yeah,
distortion or consumer fraud. It's, it's all Trump called it during Trump 1.0 fake news. What
right.
these are all the same words for things that people think are false. But in a
Mhm,
free society, we let us as the partakers in the national debate determine what is true and false. We don't bring the heavy hand of the state in to determine what is true and what is false. That is the premise of George Orwell's 1984. George
mhm,
Orwell's main character, Winston Smith, literally worked at the Ministry of Truth trying to get the government's determination as to what is true and false, and then work to excise what it believed was false or thought was false or
mhm.
wanted to be false from newspapers and whatnot. That's just not something you do in a free society.
Well, and let's move to the Trump administration. Let's talk. So, obviously, Trump has been in office now. I think this is the 101st day that we're recording this,
Hmm.
and certainly has been pretty active in cracking down on certain forms of expression. Would love to hear your take on what maybe top few crimes have been.
Well, where do I begin? This has probably been the most active 3 months in Fire's history in challenging threats to free expression from the executive branch. You have the Trump administration going after visa holders and lawful permanent residents for
Hmm.
nothing more than their protected speech.
Hmm.
When that Mahmoud Khalil and Ramessa Ozturk uh, cases came up, we were like, there's got to be more to this.
Hmm.
Mahmoud Khalil being the former Columbia University student, Ramessa Ozturk being the tough student who was snatched up off the street. But it appears, and based on the arguments that the government has put forth publicly, that the only reason they were going after these two for deportation is because of their speech. Ramessa
Hmm.
Ozturk wrote an op-ed. That seems
Yeah.
to be the only thing that she did.
Hmm.
Mahmoud Khalil led student protests at Columbia, but was not alleged to have engaged in any of the unlawful conduct, like building occupations that might have occurred as part of those
Hmm.
protests. So that's concerning. Uh, you also have the administration revoking federal funding for universities like Harvard, Columbia, Northwestern, Penn, and conditioning future funding on adopting speech codes, giving up academic freedom rights, even giving up institutional autonomy. If you look at the letter that the federal government sent to Harvard, it essentially wanted to nationalize Harvard University and take away from it its prerogative to admit students, hire faculty, choose its curriculum, and whatnot. And
Hmm.
that's a problem. That's a
Hmm.
problem, especially so if you're a conservative and you oppose big government. Wanting to
Hmm.
nationalize a university in that way is just confusing. You also have the Trump administration, and this might be the most concerning thing, issuing executive orders targeting law firms because of the clients they represent or the causes that they support. Removing things like security clearances, uh, revoking federal contracts, telling contractors who work with the federal government they can't hire these firms. So if you're
Yeah.
um, if you're the company that does the vending machines at the Pentagon and you work with one of these law firms, you need to drop them as your law firm. Even doing crazy things like saying they can't go into federal buildings, which is where you litigate many cases or might
Hmm.
negotiate with a federal agency, for example. So that's a problem. Attempting to essentially lock out law firms from the legal system because you disagree with their politics or the people that
Hmm.
they represent or the people that they hire. And then you have weird things like them banning the Associated Press from the Oval Office or in other press events because they won't adopt Gulf of America as part of their editorial standards. Um,
Right.
Now, in many of these cases, and the list could keep going on, Nick, but I
Yeah.
imagine you had just asked for the top ones. In many of these cases, the First Amendment violations are clear.
Yeah.
AP is back in the press pool. You have these law firms that have won at every stage they've litigated in striking down these executive orders. Um, where you've seen losses, and it's not because they're not getting litigated in the courts, is with Trump's targeting of media
Hmm.
entities, the ABCs of the world, the CBSs of the world, settling for tens of millions of dollars, um, and capitulating largely, we think, by all appearances, seems to be true because they're afraid of political retribution from the president. That's a problem. because
Yeah.
behavior that gets rewarded gets repeated.
So yeah, to take a couple of examples there. So first starting with the law firm. So, I spent a number of years at Skadden Arps in New York City. Skadden did not get hit with an executive order, but I think it was they were expecting to. So they entered into a settlement that resolved that. And then one of the investigatory letters that was sent by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, those were sent to a number of top law firms inquiring about their diversity hiring practices. Um, so they entered into a settlement, and obviously you're doing that because you think there's a threat to your business if you do not do that.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
called anticipatory obedience. It's this idea in authoritarian countries where the government doesn't need to punish you. You just fall in line because you know that punishment is going to happen if you don't fall in line.
right, right. And then on the media side, so one thing you've been talking a lot about lately is the Paramount merger,
Yes.
and
Paramount is the parent company of CBS and 60 Minutes.
right, and so I actually this kind of sound funny because I actually I worked on a prior iteration of this briefly when I was with my past employer, and now I can't remember where it stands right now. But basically, they need the federal government to approve the merger.
Yes, so Paramount's trying to merge with Skydance.
Right. Okay.
And what you have here is a 60-minute segment prior to the election featuring Kamala Harris, and
Hmm.
the interviewer asked Kamala Harris a question. And in the interview that actually aired, they just showed one half of her answer. But in a promotional clip, they showed the other half of her answer to that same question. And Trump is arguing that it was election interference, or I forget what the actual act is called in Texas where he's suing, but more or less that's what his argument is, and is suing Paramount for $20 billion. Um, Now, anyone who works in the news media or knows how the news media work is when you sit down for an interview with someone,
Yeah.
maybe the interview's an hour, you have a 13-minute segment, you need to cut it down.
Yeah.
So that's what 60 Minutes was doing. And even if it gave a false impression of her answer, which I don't argue it did if you actually look at the transcript,
Hmm.
it's still protected under 60 Minutes' First Amendment rights to free speech and a free press to exercise its own editorial discretion about what it thinks the best portion of this interview is to air. And this stuff happens all the time in Trump interviews. You think
Hmm.
Trump is sitting in for interviews and Fox News is airing them unedited in every case? No, that's not how it works.
Right.
So Paramount has a rock solid case, but they've got this merger, right?
Hmm.
And the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, needs to approve this merger. And Sherry Redstone, who's the majority shareholder, really wants this merger to go through. It's a big payday for her. And so
Hmm.
she was leaning on the executive editor and the executives at CBS to maybe tone down their coverage on 60 Minutes. And that's why you had the executive producer of 60 Minutes, Bill Owens, resign recently.
Hmm.
And you had Scott Pelley put together that 2-minute clip at the end of the most recent broadcast lamenting Paramount's increased involvement in 60 Minutes' coverage of the administration, which it hadn't done in any other previous administration. But the Trump administration is retributive.
Hmm.
And other news outlets have capitulated. And if you're just focused on the money and not the principle underlying free press, then maybe you do what it takes to get the merger through. But our warning is that if he gets rewarded for this, and it looks like the board has approved settlement talks. They haven't approved a settlement, but they've approved settlement talks. Then you could see more news outlets get targeted by the administration for coverage that it doesn't like.
Very interesting. Let so let I, for a second. I want to look at this from the perspective of someone on the right
Hmm.
who is not, a maybe, sure, believes in free speech, but isn't necessarily, is not working at Fire, for
Yeah.
example, and not doing that. And what they see is not just a left-leaning culture on campus, but a culture that has gotten increasingly more left-leaning over the last number of decades. I forget the numbers, but it's at some point, like if you go to the mid 20th century, there is a clear liberal advantage on campus, but it's not, and it's big, but it is not the 80 to 1 you see in certain disciplines or at certain universities now. And you say, okay, we've got this clear and obvious problem. And whatever we've done to date has not worked to reverse it. So, what options do we have? What do we do?
They're not wrong. Fire has probably been the loudest critic of universities and their
Mhm.
support for free speech, academic freedom, and viewpoint diversity over the past 25 years.
Mhm.
It's been a problem. Colleges and universities have abdicated their mission of truth seeking, the preservation, dissemination, and creation of knowledge, which requires free speech and academic freedom to
Mhm.
succeed.
Mhm.
They've become more ideological. They've become more committed to other values unrelated to truth seeking, like social justice. But you can't solve a censorship problem with more censorship. And that is what the federal government is attempting to do right now. It is attempting to implement new speech codes on campus, often surrounding issues pertaining to anti Semitism.
Mhm.
Essentially trying to define what anti Semitism is through a speech code in a way we don't do with sexism or racism, for
Mhm.
example.
Mhm.
Lumping in criticism of Israel with anti Semitism,
Right.
which is a problem. It's trying to force certain universities to either eliminate certain departments or put them under academic receivership. It's reforming or pressuring colleges to reform their disciplinary processes and even pursue disciplinary proceedings against particular faculty members and students, some of whom have already been tried
Mhm.
for certain allegations. So this could lead to double jeopardy concerns, the idea that a person can't be tried for the same infraction twice.
Mhm.
And it's all around trying to insert the federal government into these colleges and universities, nationalize them in the case of Harvard in a way that has never been done before in America. And if you
Mhm.
are a civil libertarian, if not a libertarian, you should be concerned anytime the federal government becomes more involved in the process. We've never seen a federal government that's been good for free speech on college campuses. Like the more they become involved, the more they accelerate and enhance the problem. And
Mhm.
you might think that the Trump administration is going to solve this problem. It's going to be a good corrective. But the Trump administration isn't going to be in power forever. There will be a future Democratic administration. And the precedent that you set now to give the government more control over hiring, admissions, and teaching at these
Mhm.
colleges is the same precedent that a future Democratic administration will be able to lean on to do the same.
Mhm.
And one of my greatest frustrations is that we've had conservative allies in the fight against federal overreach on campuses in the past. We talked about the Title IX context before. There
Mhm.
were conservatives who were very strongly in support of our attacks on the Biden and Obama administration's overreach in the Title IX context. But now that we're talking about the Title VI context, which governs race, color, and national origin and has been interpreted to govern anti Semitism, they're
Mhm.
completely absent. And they're making arguments like federal government's money, federal government's rules. I never heard that argument from conservatives in the Title IX context. So I'm worried that we have a case of free speech hypocrisy here,
Mhm.
that it's useful for us when it gives us the outcomes that we like. It's not useful for us, and we're going to actually attack it when it might produce outcomes that we don't like. And I think this is all short sighted. I think this is political expediency, and this isn't a stand on principle. And the work that we're trying to do here at Fire is for the long term, which means standing on principle and making sure that these principles can be durable and that gains that we make aren't going to be just washed away with the change of every administration.
Where have you seen gains? So fire's been around since 1999. Is that right?
Yes.
I think. Okay, so we're working on 26 years. Okay,
Yes,
of
we are.
doing good and committed work. 26
Mhm.
years. That's a good chunk of time. And in that time, society wide, obviously we've seen still a lot of issues. And maybe the acceleration on both sides of interference with free speech. Um, but there have been wins over that period, I would imagine.
Yes. First and
So
foremost, in the courts. The
okay.
courts have had an ever expanding interpretation of what the First Amendment protects, with a
Hmm.
few bumps in the road here and there, but generally the courts have been rock solid. since 1919, and particularly since 1931,
Hmm.
expanding First Amendment protections is the story of America, really. If you ask Americans what their most precious right is, they'll say free speech, even above the right to vote. You had people handing out birth control leaflets on the street corners in Manhattan who were arrested in the early part of the 20th century. You had communists who were arrested all the time, even deported all the
Hmm.
time in the beginning part of the 20th century. None of that happens anymore. At least didn't happen until the last 3 months. Um, and you even have Supreme Court justices like Elena Kagan arguing that the First Amendment has become weaponized to go after speech that no one envisioned being protected by the First Amendment. I think she's wrong, but that quote is an indication of how far we've come on the First Amendment. That it's a tool against censorship that is sharper than it has ever been in American history. So that's where the I think most progress has been made. We've also been able to eradicate a lot of college and university speech codes since our first report came out in, I believe, 2007. We've seen a general and steady decline in the worst sort of speech codes on college campuses. I think the salience of free speech and academic freedom as an issue on college campuses has also been positive.
Hmm.
Uh, and so there has been some good stuff happening. Where the things that haven't been good, if we're talking about just college campuses, and we can get off campuses too, uh, is that there's been a growth in the administrative class on colleges and universities. I think it's hard to overstate the bureaucratic bloat and the effect that that's had on the speech environment on college campuses. Uh, DEI plays into this because you have these diversity, equity, and inclusion offices.
Yeah,
Yeah,
can you expand on that a little bit? So obviously, people are aware of bureaucratic bloat, and that obviously that has an impact on your costs in running a college, and that there are some issues
sure.
with it. But what's the correlation? What's the relationship between that and free speech?
Well, when you have administrators who aren't involved in the actual teaching at the university, who aren't involved in the mission, so to speak, of the university, which is truth seeking,
Hmm.
um, they find other ways to keep themselves busy. And often, one way they find to keep themselves busy is through censorship. And so we've seen
Okay.
a correlation between censorship and the rise in administrators on college campuses. And these diversity, equity, and inclusion offices are often very ideological
Hmm. Yeah,
offices.
sure.
And so when they see people express themselves in a way that runs contrary to the ideology of those offices, often that will manifest itself in censorship. And you had things like political litmus tests be implemented at many colleges and universities, DEI statements, so called, where
Hmm.
you have to write an essay outlining your commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion before you can even be considered on the merits to be hired at some of these colleges or universities. It's most prominent in the University of California. But in the past couple of years, uh, we have seen some progress. We've seen colleges and universities eradicate their DEI requirements. Harvard and MIT, for example, did this. We've
Hmm.
also seen other colleges and universities adopt policies like institutional neutrality, the idea that the college or university is not going to opine or issue statements on the political issues of the day. Claudine Gay at Harvard, for example, got in a lot of trouble because she issued 7 different statements post October 7th, almost acting like a weather vane to figure out which way the political wind was going, and then rewriting her statement in accordance with that.
Yeah.
But the University of Chicago was right in 1967, I believe, when it issued its Calvin report, when it said, "We are the host and sponsors of critics. We are not ourselves the critics. So we are not the ones issuing statements. Our students and faculty can issue statements on the issue of the day, opine, participate in the national discussion, but we are the facilitators for that
Yeah.
discussion. We are not going to put our finger on the scale unless the debate implicates the core mission or interests of the university." And that's, for example, where the Harvard situation comes in. It issues a statement opposing the federal government's effort to totally reform and nationalize the university.
Yeah. So let's okay. So a couple of thoughts based on that. Okay, so first, there have been a lot of legal and legal adjacent victories for fire. I would put maybe the campus speech codes probably in maybe in the same bucket. But so one thing I like to emphasize for people is how basically how the Constitution actually protects you in practice,
Uh-huh.
because, you know, until it's interpreted, until a court tells us what something means, it's just words on a page without really much meaning. And then you can argue it, but then, we have to go to the court, and then that's where, that's where we really put the lines down. So you mentioned two cases, 1919, 1931. What was so prior to that point? What was the status quo with respect to free speech in America, and what did those cases change?
Yeah. So throughout most of American history, the First Amendment was essentially a dead letter.
Okay.
Uh, the reason I mentioned 1931 is because that is the first year where the Supreme Court struck down a speech restriction on First Amendment grounds. Never before 1931 had the Supreme Court ever struck down a speech restriction on First Amendment grounds. And those two cases were Neer v. Minnesota
Hmm.
and Stromberg v. California. The Stromberg v. California case dealt with a red flag law in the state of California, the ban on displaying red flags perceived to be supporting the Communist Party.
So a literal red flag law, not like one of today's red flag laws with respect to guns. So a
No, no,
literal red flag law.
a
Okay.
different literal red flag law.
Yeah.
And then Near v. California dealt with prior restraints, this idea that you cannot censor something before publication. And that's largely what the First Amendment was interpreted to be about by many courts
Hmm.
prior to 1931, that that the First Amendment only prohibited prior restraints, and in that case, only prior restraints as applied to the federal government. Because remember, the First Amendment says Congress shall make
Hmm.
no law. It was later incorporated to apply to uh, to the states, I believe, in a case from 1925, but I could be mistaken on that. Uh,
Hmm.
uh, so, so for most of American history, the First Amendment was a dead letter. People were censored for speech that today we would, you see just by opening up X, for
Right.
example.
Right. Yeah.
But that all began to change in 1919
Hmm.
through an effort that Oliver Wendell Holmes, the Supreme Court justice, began to push at the Supreme Court. In the spring of 1919, Oliver Wendell Holmes issued a series of rulings throwing socialists in jail, uh,
Mm.
more or less. Eugene Debs, there was a famous
Right.
case, the Schenck case, where a group of Philadelphia socialists opposing the draft, handing out leaflets, were thrown in jail. That's the famous case where Oliver Wendell Holmes said freedom of speech wouldn't protect someone falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater and causing a panic. The idea being that opposing the draft was a form of falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater and causing a panic.
That is that's very interesting. I was not aware of that context.
That's why free speech advocates really hate when people just reflexively say, well, you can't falsely shout fire in a crowded theater to justify any censorship, because we know that that phrase originates in the context of someone who was critical of World War I in the draft. Uh,
Right.
so there were a series of 4 cases uh, during that period where they threw socialists in jail.
Hmm.
And over that summer, Oliver Wendell Holmes had a philosophical and legal awakening surrounding the First Amendment. A couple of his friends started to get into his ear. Learned Hand, who would become a famous Second Circuit judge.
Yeah.
Uh, 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 there's another guy from Harvard who's actually a Brit, but was teaching at Harvard, whose name is just escaping me at the moment. But they got into his ear and they essentially argued, "You have it all wrong. This is what
Hmm.
the First Amendment should be." And in the fall of 1919, he issued a dissenting opinion in the Abrams case, which also dealt with socialists handing out leaflets, in this case calling for a general strike to oppose America's involvement in the Bolshevik Revolution.
Hmm.
Those socialists were thrown in jail, but Oliver Wendell Holmes issued a dissenting opinion that more or less would get the ball rolling
Yeah.
in support of the free speech interpretations that we take for granted under the First Amendment today. Um,
Gosh,
it's
isn't that interesting?
there was a book that was written by a Columbia University law professor called The Great Dissent, which is about his dissent in that Abrams case and how it changed America's conception of free speech, even though it was a dissenting opinion and not a majority opinion. And
Yeah.
if you read some of Oliver Wendell Holmes's letters in that intervening period between the spring and fall, he recognizes that he kind of got wrapped up in the war hysteria surrounding World War One. And they were throwing people in jail who shouldn't have been thrown in jail. They were abandoning constitutional principles. And he even writes in a letter that when the war ends, he thinks there's some pardoning that needs to happen. And he even notes that some judges have gotten hysterical. He didn't say he got hysterical,
Well, no, of course.
um, but that was kind of the suggestion,
Yeah.
that he got hysterical. He writes in his Abrams dissent that time has upset many fighting faiths, and I I, I think underlining that quote is that time had upset his fighting faith
Mhm.
in what he saw as more of a narrow interpretation of the First Amendment rather than the expansive one that he had in Abrams. But you're right, Nick. The Constitution is only a parchment barrier.
Right, right.
North Korea, Russia, they all have constitutions too that promise free speech, but it means absolutely nothing. And that's why Justice Learned Hand, or Judge Learned Hand, who I'd mentioned before,
Yeah.
famous 1944 speech, "The Spirit of Liberty," is so powerful. He says, when the spirit, he said, "The spirit of liberty lies in the hearts of men and women, and when it dies there, no law, no constitution can save it."
Yeah.
Talks about how the spirit of liberty is the spirit that is not too sure that it is right. That's Douglas Wilson we talked about at the top of this podcast, the idea that he always thinks he's right, but he doesn't think he's always right.
Yeah.
Um, and so we need, as Americans, not just the law, which is important because it gives us legal recourse,
Mhm.
but also the spirit of liberty, the spirit that we're not going to go after our ideological opponents for what they say and try and punish them. We are going to engage in devil's advocacy and thought experimentation and talking across the lines of difference. And the idea that even this stuff can be fun and that our power comes from our pluralism. But right now, I think there is an instinct on behalf of many people to just reach for that raw power and not reach for the principle that, you know, we live in a free society. We live in a pluralistic country where people are going to have different opinions from us. And the way to resolve those differences of opinion is through debate and discussion and not censorship.
Yeah. So, I think that's great. It's kind of funny for me, you know, thinking about talking to you because my goal in this podcast is to kind of, briefly put, demystify the right for the left and vice versa. I'm not really approaching this as a partisan, although obviously I am a partisan. I have my own partisan beliefs. Trying not to approach it just to convince people that I'm right on some particular political issue.
Mhm.
Uh, but with respect to free speech, I really do feel a little a little more passionate about it because it does seem to underlie so much of everything else. You can't have free and open political debate about these things if you don't have that underlying freedom to say what you believe and what you might think to be correct or think to be wrong or whatever, and
Mhm.
and talk it out. And so you can rack up all these victories in the courts, and then you get some maybe anticipatory stuff, obedience. I know that Fire has had some success sending letters to universities and other organizations that have caused them to realize,
Yes.
like, okay, maybe we've misstepped. So your background, I understand, is in communications.
Yeah, that's where I spent most of my career at Fire before I transitioned into this executive vice president role where I'm doing more writing, speaking, higher level management
Yeah,
at the organization. I'm writing a book right now.
I saw that on LinkedIn. Yeah, I had a brief panicked moment where it's like, oh my gosh, I'm interviewing him. I didn't read his book, and then
No,
I
the
saw it
book's
come.
not out yet.
Yeah, okay.
Doing the research and the writing for that, and I'll be going on book leave later in the year. But I also made a documentary in 2020 about former
Mm,
ACLU executive director Ira Glasser, his story,
mhm,
which I think is a very powerful one, and the importance of defending free speech, and in particularly its intersection with fight for racial justice, which was also
mm,
something that Ira Glasser was deeply passionate about. But unlike many of today's younger activists, he didn't see them as in conflict. He saw them more in the line of how the late John Lewis saw them, which is, John Lewis believed that without freedom of speech and the right to dissent, the civil rights movement would have been a bird without wings. And
Hmm.
that's how Ira really looked at it, because he saw the censorship and the speech restrictions that were happening during the civil rights era. And I think that's why, in some cases, the left abandoned free speech over the last decade, because it didn't grow up with the civil rights era, the Vietnam War era, the McCarthy era, and how free speech was essential in pushing back and fighting back against um, those abuses of causes that they cared about, in the same way that Ira's generation did.
Yeah. So that's it's interesting you say that because I think there's an alternative explanation. Um, because so you see, a lot of people on the right now did grow up with the left inhibiting, pushing back on their free speech and restricting it, on campus
Uh-huh.
and other places. And so would you say, yes, I think there's a good argument that it has to do with, kind of forgetting the history and forgetting what comes for it. And then another part of it, it just seems to relate to power. And once you have the power, it's like when you don't have the power, it's like we absolutely want free speech because we want to be able to convince people that we're right. And then we finally got the power. Discussion's over, baby.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Elon Musk talked a really good game about free speech before he held the keys to the kingdom on Twitter.
Yeah,
Uh,
right.
he was holding himself out to be the free speech savior.
Mm,
But as we wrote on our website, he ended up being a false prophet, and talks now about going after people for lies and propaganda that they put out about Tesla, suggesting that he's going to weaponize the federal government and his contacts there. Ed Martin, the district
mm,
attorney um,
right.
in D.C., for example, is a bulldog, thinks of himself as President Trump's personal attorney. Um, and that's a problem. And I talked to Matt Taibbi, who worked on the Twitter files,
Mm,
interviewed him, and I asked him about this because he had a falling out with Elon Musk. And he said, just as you said, Nick, the problem is power. Once you get power, censorship is a very alluring tool to reach your desired outcomes. A famous writer once said that sex is the second strongest instinct in humans, second only to censorship. And he's probably right about that.
yeah. That's funny. Well put. So I think so. The question then is, if you're coming at this from a communications perspective, because I have the legal background, and you can rack up a lot of wins in the courts and not win and without winning in the court of public opinion.
Uh-huh.
So how does what's like this is just asking kind of a strategy question. In communications at Fire, how do you go about planning, public outreach, planning communications? How do you, uh, yeah, what's the thinking for battle of public opinion?
I wish we had the silver bullet answer. I wish I could say I have this all figured out, but I
Have
don't.
you tried censoring people?
We have not. We have not, but maybe that's the key to the kingdom. Uh, no, the most effective thing is to reach people when free speech is front of mind for them. And it's usually front of mind when the censors are targeting causes that they care about.
Yeah,
Very few are the people who just like free speech for free speech's sake,
yeah.
who are committed to it as a philosophical or overarching governing principle. They
Whose
usually,
whose drive for sex overwhelms their desire to
yes,
censor. Yeah,
most people have an instrumentalist view of free speech when push comes to shove, which is
right.
it is an instrument to advance other causes that they care about. And when those other causes that they care about are being censored, they fall back on free speech as a tool to fight back.
Yeah.
And that's just the reality of it. Um, we're weird in the sense that we care about this issue independent of any other cause.
Right.
Um, so the strategy then is when people are being censored, you use that censorship to raise their awareness and appreciation for free speech, and try in that context to get them to appreciate free speech as an individualized principle,
Yeah.
and hope that when the boot is on the other foot, or the boot is on their foot, that they'll adhere to that principle and not reach for the tools of censorship. And that's why I'm super disappointed with conservatives at this current moment. We locked arms with them in the fight against campus censorship. We locked arms with them when the Biden administration was pressuring social media companies to censor.
Mhm.
But now that they have the power, they are trying to implement speech codes on college campuses. They are trying to jawbone and censor media companies. They're not using the word misinformation. They're not using the word disinformation. But when they talk about news distortion or election interference or consumer fraud, they're talking about the same thing.
Mhm.
And you just had Speaker Mike Johnson talk about how they were able to get billboards taken down in certain congressional districts targeting Republicans who Democrats thought were trying to gut Medicaid. Now, you can go either way on whether Republicans are actually trying to gut Medicaid under President Trump's proposed budget, but these are the sort of contested political claims that you fight out in the court of public opinion. You don't do as the Republicans in Congress did, send cease and desist letters to 3 different billboard companies threatening them with defamation lawsuits because the Democrats claim that Republicans in Congress are trying to gut Medicaid.
Right.
And when you have a very um, retributive, a um, sensitive, thin-skinned leader of the Republican Party who has shown a willingness to go after political and ideological opponents, you can hardly blame the billboard companies for taking those ads down. But this is
Right.
how a culture of free expression gets eroded. It's not when you lose necessarily in the court of law, but it's when you don't even have to go to the court of law to achieve censorship.
Right.
And that's where we're at in this current moment. And Republicans understood this. Free speech was a cause that Donald Trump celebrated as he was coming into office. And you had free speech champions hopeful that he might be good for free speech. But he's been hardly anything that free speech advocates should cheer about in the 100 days that he's been in office thus far.
Man, that's tough. And I think that's a good place to close our conversation.
Oh, on that pessimistic?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is,
Man, if I knew we
it's,
were closing there, I might have ended on a high note.
oh,
But
well,
maybe we want to keep people scared.
well, the thing is, I kind of almost do want people scared because I do think on the left, my background politically is more on the left, and there is this, a drive towards censoriousness. Yes.
It's
Eh,
a it's censorious
no, no,
or
no.
sensorial. There's
It's,
a big debate as to whether you use sensorial or censorious.
oh,
I use sensorial because I think that's more correct than censorious, but I hear
I
censorious too.
might I might shift over to that because I think it might be a little easier to say. But I've spent a lot of time in circles where I'm surrounded by other people on the left. Spent a lot of time on campus. I ended up majoring in English, and then I went to law school. You are not surrounded all the time by conservative thinkers. You're hearing a lot of what, and there can certainly be a lot of pressure, not just to censor, but to self censor. And so you end up with, you don't challenge dominant ideas and dogmas, and then yeah, I mean, I had another thought there, but it's not great.
Mm,
And then yeah, just so at this time that the Trump administration is doing a lot of things against free speech, which are not great, and Democrats are rightly pushing back. You don't want them to forget that at some point the boot will be on the other foot, back on the other foot, and
mhm.
that this time around, don't use it,
Yeah, we'll see.
or use it going the other direction. It's
That's what you want them to do,
yeah,
but that might be the triumph of hope over experience because the
yeah,
the story of free speech for millennia has been those in power, when they have the opportunity, will try to shut up their political opponents. It's just the way it
yeah.
is, and it happens to different degrees, but it usually always happens. So,
Well, dang,
and
that's even more pessimistic. Let's
that's all right, but doesn't mean doesn't mean that you stop fighting.
yeah.
And actually, over the long term, we've made a lot of progress, as I mentioned.
What's the absolute best case scenario? I'm thinking it's like what would it take? If we're talking about this silver bullet, like would it take a president who is really committed, not just in word but in action, to the principle of free speech, who restrains his or her own party, who leads from the front on free speech? What would it take to really get public opinion going the other way?
Well, yeah, I think it would be to have a candidate that people are really attached to,
Yeah.
in the same way that the Republican base is really attached to Donald Trump, who makes free speech a primary campaign issue, but then when is in power, actually adheres to that principle and makes and helps create it as part of people's identity. But the problem is that we as humans are tribal by nature,
Mm.
and even if you get this great candidate on one side of the aisle or the other, you're going to have 50% give or take of the population on the other side who are just going to reflexively oppose that
Right.
principle because
Right.
it's the other guy who's advocating for it. Just like the Democrats right now with tariffs, like they're anti-tariff, but Democrats have
Oh, super
largely,
anti. Yeah.
uh, been opposed in many ways to some of these free trade agreements over the past 30, 40 years. So,
Right.
uh,
Right.
and Democrats now are more interventionist in their foreign policy now that the Republicans have become more. Um,
Right.
I don't want to use the word isolationist
Yeah,
because that.
you pick your
But
pick your
people know what I'm saying is like if
Yeah.
Trump's
Oh,
for
yeah.
something, the Democrats are going to be against it. If the
Oh,
Democrats
yeah.
are for something, the Republicans are going to be against it. And so I
Yeah.
worry about it, free speech becoming that political football. But what are you going to do? Um, we just keep doing the work. We just
Yeah.
keep doing the work.
And maybe that's what, that's the optimistic end. It's like, the fact that, we have these instinct there. I, the role of society, writ large, if you really zoom out, does seem to be, or one possible function of society at its best is to restrain what is natural in humans that is not good,
Hmm.
and hopefully, fight the good fight, and eventually, maybe not win finally, but win some battles along the way, get momentum going the
We've
right
won
way.
a lot of battles along the way. The last
Yeah,
100 years, we've won a lot of battles. So I don't want to lose the forest for the trees here. But
yeah.
um,
Well,
still more battles to win.
yeah, plenty more battles to fight, plenty more battles to win. Nico Perrino, Executive Director of FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, has been awesome. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Thanks for having me.
All right, and that was the interview. Thank you very much for listening. If you wouldn't mind, please do leave a review for the podcast. I believe those are important. And subscribe to the newsletter, which will be linked in the show notes or can be found at neverclosetheinquiry.substack.com. Thanks.